I'm from the Wirral, which is a little peninsula on the northwest opposite Liverpool, and I'm from a place called Wallasey, which is, well, it's kind of nearly all coastline, isn't it? But it's the coastline goes all the way around it, but it's not that far from the seafront. And I lived in a big house with my mum and dad and sisters and brother and my nan and granddad as well, because they had a flat in the middle of the house as well. So it was a bouncy household. I always had a sense of wanting to get out, but I can't remember from what sense and what time. I can't remember the actual times I started to get fidgety. I always had an escapist attitude. I used to dress up a lot. Mum had lots of like big kind of 70s clothes and, you know, big hats and platform shoes and all that kind of thing. And then when you went into Nan's flat, my grandfather was in the police, so she had loads of kind of formal sort of evening gloves and diamante sort of, you know, tiaras and fair turbans, a box full of turbans. So it was really good for dressing up. So I used to kind of do this kind of weird mixture of the two things in some sort of funny drag ensembles, I reckon that's what they were. I was the youngest, so everybody kind of left. So there was a lot of time when it was just kind of me with my grandparents and my mum and dad from a quite youngest age. So it was a bit kind of like an only child with kind of older brothers and sisters who... you know, kind of like more my sisters almost to be my mom and stuff. So it was funny in that sense, I guess, and kind of just be with adults all the time. So you're kind of like with the adults, but then you're kind of, you know, you're the kid, but then you're kind of with adults all the time. So it's funny in that sense, but yeah, they just kind of let me get on with it. And dad was a carpenter, and so we had like a couple of sheds and loads of bits and bobs of stuff that you could kind of make stuff with as well. So it was good in the sense that I could have loads of friends around and make loads of noise, and it didn't really matter because it was quite a big house, and it was you know, and it wasn't kind of necessarily, you know, kind of fancy precious house. It was a bit sort of half falling apart as well, and so it was good in that sense. You could just do whatever really. I think they're definitely formative years. When I was young, I used to have a Hoover and an ironing board and like lots of kind of girls' toys, not in a kind of liberal middle class way. It was just a kind of like keep him quiet way. It wasn't like definitely wasn't sort of you know, let's let him discover himself. It was just like, let's get him out of the way. And I used to have those kind of toys, but in a very unconscious way. And then you become a little bit conscious. You become conscious of yourself, you become conscious of physicality, and you become conscious of your kind of gender and gender roles as you get a little bit older, right? So then it's like, yeah, right. So then I kind of switched to interior design, which kind of felt a bit more safe. And the spotlight had kind of, you know, shifted away a little bit. And then I started to get into, I guess now what they would say is 80s casual, you know, without really knowing the label of what it was then. But that would be that, which was kind of when I was about 9 or 10, buying those kind of clothes. And then I think my final kind of aesthetic of what I went on to do with styling and with New Pilot Studio was probably a combination of both of those things. And I kind of didn't really realise that, especially when I kind of, because I didn't come through a fashion education, I kind of just did it. So it wasn't, I hadn't gone through a system where I had a kind of tutoring around me that said, you know, oh, yours is a little bit like, you know, gay camp blah blah meets 80s casuals. There's no one to kind of tell me that. I kind of had to sort of keep doing it, and then sort of it kind of formed a little bit more, definitely I would say, with when I did New Power Studio. It definitely formed a little bit more then. I could sort of see it a little bit more clearly, and I kind of was like, oh right, this is kind of both those things, you know. So where I grew up was just kind of suburban streets, a bit sort of boring, and kind of play out on the street on your bike. And then as you got a little bit older, you kind of ventured a little bit further away. So I don't know, New Brighton was maybe like a couple of miles away. But that was the kind of like broken down former seaside kind of glory days. You know, like typical English broken down kind of seaside town sort of. Arcades and, you know, a bit of a fairground and, you know, a place where a tower had been, and a place where a pier had been, and a place where lots of things had been. But it did have this huge Lido, massive Lido, Don't quote me actually, but I'm not too sure if it was the biggest in Europe or maybe the biggest in the world at the time, but then it became biggest in Europe or something like that. It was really huge anyway. It was absolutely enormous. So that in the summer was the kind of place to go. And it was, I can't remember, it's like 20 pence to get in or something. So my friend Tim, his sister Nuala, used to work in a tractor and kind of bus tyre like place, which was great. So we used to go and get inner tubes off her, go to see Nuala, get inner tubes off Nuala, and she'd give us these big, huge, blow them up. They never used to let them on the bus actually, so we used to have to kind of roll them down. It just took hours. Roll them down, and we'd take them in there, and it was huge. And it was kind of like there was areas that were like, you know, this more like the couples area, and that was more like the sort of hard scally kind of area, and that was like, you know, it's a bit like that, a family's area, and it was freezing cold water, and you just take a packed lunch and stay all day. There's in looking in Last Resort, Martin Parr book, there's a couple of pictures from there, but there's a really good picture of the hot dog queue and the girl who's kind of facing the camera, and there's a boy who's kind of looking at her tits. And that was like, that kind of sums it up. It was like standing in a hot dog queue for like hours and hours and hours for a really horrible hot dog. And then really high diving board. There's a really high diving board which had like a black, like the water was kind of black and darker because it was you know, it was a lot deeper underneath there. And once you went up, you couldn't go down because there was a queue like on the ladder. So you'd have all these kids that were like, yeah, go on, let's get up there. And you like halfway up, you're like, oh my God, it's really, really high. And you look down, you see the black kind of hole of water. And occasionally there would be like a crying kind of kid, like allowed halfway back down the ladder and stuff like that. But I mean, partly because it was impractical to do that, but then also it was, you know, the shame of kind of, you know, having to go back down the ladder and all your friends, like, you know, going to watch you and stuff. So that was always a kind of thing that you would kind of maybe do. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a northern brand of masculinity. I mean, I'm sure if you went to kind of, I mean, I guess the sort of more working class sort of brand of masculinity, which is like, you know, well, what it is now, I don't really know, but then it's very, very tough and very kind of boy and girl, you know, and that's what it was. It was like, you know, in that same area, then one of the first years I started to go out like clubbing. So the Tom Woods book, Looking for Love, is the Chelsea Reach, which is kind of that's actually a couple of generations above me, but like we definitely would have gone there. And another place called the Grand, and maybe RJ's if you were kind of feeling a little bit lucky because that was a bit harder to get into. But I was really tall, and so I was probably, like when I was about 12, 13, I was probably like, I mean, at least 6 foot, I reckon. So I was probably one of the fewer boys that could get in and wear, you know, wear whatever. There's a shirt and tie sets from the market for £5. Wear them with your school shoes, save up all your dinner money for drink, and go in before a certain time. The bouncers weren't there and all that kind of thing. I could just about get away with it. But I think that they were hard, you know, they were really, really hard. There was lots of fights. I wasn't very interested in the girls, that's for sure. But you definitely couldn't. I mean, you know, you couldn't be like out or gay or anything. It was like boys and girls. It was like girls dancing around the handbags, and boys sort of shuffling around a little bit, maybe dancing. There'd be a guy that danced, but it wasn't really necessarily the done thing to dance so much. And then like lots of slow dancing at the end of the night, and very sort of typical, kind of old-fashioned, stereotypical thing, pre-acid house. And lots of fights, and lots of, you know, blood on the floor and all that kind of thing. And yeah, I got my head kicked in a few times actually. If you're tall, people want to kick your head in. Boys want to kick your head in. They'll just go for you, and they did. And so you had to kind of skate that. I don't know. I didn't do too badly. I was all right, but I did get my head kicked in a couple of times. I probably deserved it, to be honest. I don't know if that's sort of like, you know, psychologically correlated with me wanting to feel more grown up because of what I just told you before about like living in a house of adults. But I thought, oh, this is better than being a kid. It's definitely more exciting, and you know, drinking was more exciting, and dancing and flashing lights and all that kind of thing was exciting. And I liked the idea that I could get away with it, because I said it was only the kind of chosen few of the boys, like maybe like, you know, someone that had a bit of a beard for some weird reason, or you know, always big, or some of the girls that could make themselves easily look a little bit older with makeup and stuff. So I like that, and I like that it kind of, it could probably give me some sort of stupid cachet again, you know, to add to my kind of fragile ego at the time. Obviously, kind of, you know, being gay and stuff, and being aware of that, and then kind of thinking, you know, becoming like 15, 16, thinking, oh, what's going to happen now? Like, I don't want to carry on in this environment, because kind of the pressure mounts. I think you can get away with being a bit sort of like young and maybe like have a couple of girlfriends to fool around and be like not really kind of whatever, but especially if you do get interest from girls and you're kind of not that sort of interested. I did have girlfriends and stuff, and then the pressure mounts, and the pressure mounts to be that kind of guy as well. And as I said, I was very tall, so it's like, you know, to be something, there is that that masculine kind of pressure. But like, by the skin of my teeth, acid house came along, and just as I left school, so when I was 15 and 16, I started to kind of go through a couple of things just before I left school, and then everything changed. Like, the whole landscape changed, like, and it was just fantastic, because it didn't change for all of those kind of people that I just mentioned. Like, you know, I started to kind of go to some parties and stuff like that, and people didn't really kind of know what it was. I remember getting chased down a road by these kids who were calling me Sweat, which Sweat, you know, Sweat is like was like a slang name for like you know, heavy metal person, right? Because I had long hair, and they had like no reference point for long hair apart from like heavy metal people. I was like, why do they call me a Sweat? It's so weird. They didn't know what raves were or anything like that. And so there's a kind of couple of us. I went to art school, and there's a couple of kids that I met there, and we started going to these acid house parties. Went to one in Birkenhead, which was kind of called a basement. It was an old car park, and it was acid house, hip house, early house, Chicago house, I guess. And then as soon as I got like a little bit older, I had some older friends, and we started going over to Liverpool. We started going to probably the end of the State, which is amazing. The State is an old tea room, I think, in a beautiful, beautiful space in Liverpool, with a central dance floor and kind of all marble and wooden, and it's really fantastic. And that was one of there might have been a few before, but I think it was one of the kind of first kind of seminal places in Liverpool for acid house and house music. And his Mike Nola and John Kelly and Andy Carroll, I think they were there. They were definitely on Quadrant Park. And then it went to then the Quadrant Park opened, which was in Bootle, and Bootle is rough as it gets, and it's right up the Dock Road. You have to go up there in the car, and it was, I think, probably like an old, but it looks like an old 80s nightclub, a little bit like those ones like the Octagon. Like, I guess it would be like the kind of place that they would have gone to on the Hitman and Hair, like a huge, like old, you know, like a huge, like new build industrial in the middle of nowhere destination kind of place, like 3 floors, you know, big dance floor kind of thing. And then they, I guess, I don't know the exact how it started, but they had this very successful night, which we used to call the Quad, which is every Saturday night, which became it. You know, that was it. That was it for a couple of years, and we used to go religiously. So it was kind of talking about what happened at the Quad from like Monday to the kind of Wednesday, and then sort of then you start thinking about maybe what you're going to wear, and talking about what's maybe going to happen at the Quad, and then you kind of go on Saturday, and that was it really. It was good because you could be asexual, because everyone kind of had long hair and baggy clothes, and it was a bit kind of hippie, you know. It had hippie undertones, and it was great. It was great for the girls because they could hang around with boys as friends, and people were just pilled up basically. You know, it was loved up, and it wasn't. It was just not the same thing. So I could kind of slip beneath, you know, which was really good. Yeah, I'm sure loads of people were having sex, but it didn't really matter. The pressure, just like a light switch had gone, and you could dance. You know, all the boys danced, all the boys had long hair, all the girls had long hair. everyone had baggy clothes on, everyone was just pilled up hugging each other. So it wasn't really that boys and girls. That whole thing was completely... And then also what was really curious as well is that all those kind of like guys that I would have saw that wanted to like kick my head in, or probably did kick my head in at some point, like after a year or so you start to see some of them appearing in that environment, and you'd be like, oh my god, there's, you know, so and so, and they stood out that sort of front because I knew who they were from my area, and you know, knew what they were like, and they were involved in gangs or whatever. And I was like, oh god, there's so and so, but it didn't matter because they were just completely pilled up, and they'd come over and they'd recognise you, they'd hug you. And you know, there's lots of stuff that's been written about this kind of change culturally because of ecstasy, football hooliganism, and all that kind of thing. But that was it, and you know, and I completely was there at that time. I could remember like actual people that happened to, and it just kind of opened people up. You know, it opened people up to conversations and experiences that they just hadn't had before. You know, and I think it changed a lot of people from that time on. I think it changed the country from that time on, actually. You know, culturally in Britain. Parallel to that, though, I was always interested in magazine because I was always interested in the Face and ID and I don't know, Lawama Vogue, and there's kind of like big meaty collections things as well, because I was always kind of interested in that. Because even though there was a kind of a bit of an anti with acid house where you wouldn't necessarily, there was kind of fashion in there as well. You know, there was people were into kind of labels within that. You know, like I know Chevignon, Naf Naf, and you know those kind of labels at that time people were into, and then it developed onto, you know, lots of other things as well. Chippy and stuff. Then people are into kind of French ones, which I think maybe came from a French hip hop thing. I'm not too sure, but they're into those ones. And then there'd be like all these like independent. You had Quiggins, which was in Liverpool, which was like centered around all these kind of little independent stores that used to make these kind of like funny tracksuits and stuff. And then people would mix that with, you'd have like these little weird trends where people would be wearing, you know, a certain bomber jacket or a certain kind of like, you know, Timberland boot, or certain things that, or some weird like dead stock trainer. There'd be like these kind of, I can't remember what they're called, Rival Low. There's Rival Low and Rival High. And there was these guys that were really, and Champion as well, they'd found a load of dead stock in the market and they didn't know what they were. And then word got round and everybody went and bought these trainers for 25 quid. I can remember having a conversation with people like on sofas and stuff and saying, oh, what would happen if this stopped? What would happen if this, and yeah, what would you do if this happened? Or, you know, I can remember having that. Yeah, because also they were quite sort of grim times, you know. It's sort of Thatchery kind of times, and just like there was such a sort of massive focus on God, you know, I remember kids like growing, you know, I mean it's very sort of like lefty where I grew up, and you know, everyone was into Labour, and you know, and also very kind of like, you know, signing on and working as a sort of supposed political act, you know, like, you know, just like not necessarily conscious, but very like anti-government and anti all of that. But then there was also this kind of other thing with the one, you know, the ones that weren't that, they had this kind of like weird aspiration, this like yuppie aspiration, which was you know, consumerist and you know, elbow everyone out the way. And you know, I guess it was a bit of a mixture of all those kind of things in a sense, but this kind of broke away from that. I don't know if I was necessarily conscious of that at the time, but you definitely thought, oh, this is good. And also as well, I mean, you know, this wasn't really, there was like political aspects of what happened within the party scene, whereas, you know, they changed the licensing laws, or they brought in, you know, the freedom to party, you know, there's all kind of stuff, debates around that happened at the time, consequently, because of these raves and licensing and all that. But it wasn't politicized in the sense of, okay, we're going to do this because of that. It was kind of it's like utopian escapism, really. That's kind of all it was. It didn't have an agenda. It started to form them because there was restrictions, like they tried to put stops to them and stuff. So I was at one of the first raves, because everyone used to go to Blackburn afterwards. So you go to Blackburn afterwards and you go there till like, and then there'd be like free parties in Blackburn before they had all-nighters. So everything shot at 2, right? So that Quadrant Park I was just telling you about, that had one of the first all-nighters in the north, I think, or maybe in the country, I'm not too sure. So people just come from Manchester and different places to go to that, which was open till 6. But before that, you'd have to go to Blackburn. So all the old kind of like footage that you'd see of kind of raves and going down a motorway and all that kind of thing is when you go from Liverpool to Blackburn or different places, but mainly Blackburn and we go to, and they get people from Manchester, right, and you see these miles long convoys, and there'd be these kind of parties in warehouses that have been broken up to and sound systems and stuff. I think they were exciting. God, that was very exciting. Definitely exciting. And I was dead young as well, so I was only just 16, 17. So I definitely didn't tell my mum I was going to Blackburn and taking acid for 10 hours. That's for sure. And probably at the same sort of time, probably go to Manchester and go to places like Geese and L'Homme. And L'Homme was Richard Cream. So yeah, like I'm tall. He's really tall. He's like 7 foot something. He was like, the whole experience is absolutely terrifying. Like me and my friend used to go up there, and so the only access that you had then, because you didn't have the internet, the only access that you had to like any of this imagery of like Comme des Garçons or Izumiyaki or any of these kind of labels was through like stuff that you'd see in the face or ID, and you'd see like a little bit of a top or something like that. Or in L'Homme, L'Humo, those collections, kind of big collections-y kind of things, which we kind of like chip in to buy one of those, expensive at the time. And they'd have like these little kind of, 2-page, double-page spread of like a Comme des Garçons show, And then there'd be editorial as well, so like little bits of editorial in the face and ID. Yeah, I was just always really interested in these kind of crazy clothes. It's like, especially the deconstructed ones. Because they were so expensive and they just kind of looked like tramps' clothes, they were like falling apart, and I just thought that was really, really interesting. Everyone was so super into clothes. Yeah, like I said when I was first started getting into kind of like what you would say is casuals now, when I was like 9 or 10, it's like I got clothes and trainers for every Christmas and birthday from that age, and really expensive things for what means, and very sort of select things. And all my friends were like that as well. And we know how much everything was and stuff. And you kind of like your mum was kind of completely bewildered as to why you were getting a pair of £7 socks, and why you couldn't put them in the tumble dryer. They were just thought of mental, But it was. I guess that's another form of escapism. No, so that's always been definitely from when I was very, very young as well. And then just continued. But then I guess it just goes on new levels. I think the kind of like you sort of search for different things. So the kind of deconstructed kind of like £1,000 kind of Comme des Garçons jacket was a kind of interesting, because that's got like another ante within it, hasn't it? Which is to look like you've got no money, because all those things I mentioned before, I suppose, well, maybe not the acid house thing, but or to look like you have some money. Especially the casual thing was very much about kind of like how much things cost and stuff. So then we terrifiedly go to Richard Cream's shop, and it was like, I can't remember, it was very minimal inside, and there was a buzzer, and you kind of like look through the door very suspiciously, probably rightly so. These couple of like nervous sort of scally boys from the Wirral, and we kind of go in. It was just completely silent. There might have been music in my head. It was completely silent, and there was just like I do remember a pair of like Comme des Garçons winkle pickers that were like had like Tipex kind of French writing on them. Only about £200 or something, and we were always trying to like not laugh and gasp at the same time, try to be really cool. And it was like way more money than we like had, but yeah, it was ridiculous. But we liked the ridiculousness of it. And my friend was like into art and architecture and all that kind of thing. So we revelled in that. And I guess also that's a little bit more like the kind of weird yuppie aspirational thing as well. But yeah, definitely that. And then later on from that, obviously didn't kind of buy anything from there. It was a bit more grown up as well, actually, I would say. It was like a bit more suity, that one. And then it was Geese. So Geese was a little bit more clubby, if you like. And then I guess that was sort of, they used to sell all kinds of stuff there then. You'd say they sell Westwood and Nick Coleman and Destroy and Workers of Freedom, things like that, I think, actually. A little bit more kind of gay, for want of a better word. A little bit more body conscious as well, because they had like a lot more of a gay community, visible gay community. And then they also had like nights like Flesh at the Hacienda. So they had that kind of market. So there would be, I can't remember his name, but there would be a really sort of tall guy that worked at the shop that would be kind of like voguing, you know, like terrifyingly kind of voguing. And we'd be like, you know, I was like so scared of gay people. And I wasn't kind of out then or anything, you know. Well, I thought I wasn't, but I probably was, you know, out of the chiffon closet. But I definitely hadn't, you know, come out or whatever. Yeah, so that was all very interesting. I mean, going by a few things from there, and I was still kind of going around Liverpool then, I think, actually. And then that was it, really. And then I moved to London when I was 21. I guess I sort of half fell into styling because I arrived in London with like no plan about anything apart from just kind of wanting to be in London. And no job and no kind of where to live and all that. It's just like, you know, and I didn't come to college. And my friend worked in Selfridges, like the guy that was, well, we weren't even really that close friends, but he worked in Selfridges doing the windows. And I popped in to see him one day and he was on holiday. And then, you know, luckily for me, there was a kind of old guy with a penchant for young guys. They're just taken over, and he sort of said, "Do you want a job?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay, cool." So I got given a job as to be doing the windows and all that kind of thing. I did a few shoots for Sleaze Nation and stuff like that. So I spent probably about 8 years doing men's fashion styling for like ID and Days and Arena Home Plus and Another and that kind of thing. And I was working with some designers like Anne-Sophie Bach, Carrie Cassette Player and Siv Stoldall. And I finally met Dave Sims after kind of poring over his photographs for a long time, and absolutely loved what he'd done, the way he kind of captured, you know, definitely where he captured the male, but you know, not only that, just, you know, lots of other things. And I always really loved his work. And then he was working on a project for Self-Service, and he's got family roots in Liverpool, and he has a close affinity to Liverpool. And in Self-Service, I was doing for a project. It was maybe it was 2010. I don't get the exact date of that, and he wanted to kind of go up there, and I'd gone up there and done some casting. And we started off doing something, casting kind of Liverpool boys and girls and different things. We kind of went up there, and then we decided it maybe should just be the girls. So I went up there for a couple of weeks, and we just kind of went street casting. And then the Self-Service, where maybe we were talking about kind of, you know, getting some kind of fashion element in there. And then we both decided that I didn't think there would be anything that I could bring to it. And it felt a little bit, you know, I don't want to be like putting baubles on the Christmas tree. And so we decided to just have it as a casting project, and we decided on just the girls. So then we kind of booked a big space in the Adelphi Hotel, which is, you know, one of the kind of most famous old hotels in Liverpool, which has got, you know, these amazing suites with trunk rooms and stuff where you put all the trunks in, so you can kind of walk inside and stuff. Really grand hotel, but kind of a bit broken down and very charming and very funny. There's a documentary about it which was just amazing, and everyone that works there is a kind of very funny character, which you will see if you ever see the documentary. But we booked this kind of, got this massive kind of big ballroomy kind of suites round the outside of the main lobby, and then we booked one of those, and we did this photo shoot with all the girls. And it was just hysterical because everyone was really suspicious about the whole thing. Self-service, so they didn't know what self-service was, that's for sure. And so we had to get the agent to send up self-service, and then we had to kind of earmark, you know, campaigns that Dave had done to kind of make, you know, which was like at the time was like, you know, Balenciaga and like Jill Sander and all these kind of things, which maybe they also might not have heard of. You know, we all loved the fact that they weren't really interested in heard of it as well, obviously. And they were just like, you know, self-service sounds like a wank mag, you know. So they kind of thought it was like this porny mag or something like that, you know. And then I had to sort of, you know, explain that Dave is a great photographer and all that kind of thing and stuff. But I think also when you Google like Dave Sims, it comes off with this like surf photographer as well at the same time. So it was all getting very confused. So we got all these girls coming, and it was just amazing, you know. It was so good. We went out to clubs. We did some pictures out there as well. We had a really nice time. And Dave come up and, you know, spent a lot of time in Liverpool, went to his family and stuff. And just the girls, as we saw them when they were out, we got them to bring their clothes. And they brought, you know, that and their mum and the sister and like 5 other outfits, like all completely like, you know, at the time it was probably a little bit like Cavalli-esque, you know, that kind of thing. But like also variations of different things, and it just bring all, well, I've got this, and I've got this, and I've got this, and I've got this. And the mums would ring me up, you know, and be dead, you know, asking like, what do you want with our Lindsay? You stopped her in town, what do you want her for? And all this sort of thing. And it was just very funny anyway. But also very kind of sweet without being patronising. And I think the thing that we definitely were, you know, that hits you is the responsibility for those images. You know, obviously it's his responsibility more than mine in that sense, but you know, you definitely could have gone up there and done, you know, what the Mirror does for like Aintree Ladies' Day, you know, where you kind of look at loads of kind of like wags falling over and you know, the caked on makeup and the free eyelashes and all that kind of, you can go up there, but the first thing that hits you is the ears and all that. There's lots of the variations. There's tons of beautiful girls in Liverpool that aren't that, and also if they are that, that's also okay, because where does the judgment lie with that? You know, who's to say what's right, wrong, or any of that kind of thing? But also it's just like, you know, so it's we're very careful about the edit, you know, like how people are represented or how they're not represented and all that kind of thing, because it would have been so easy to do that. But it was an amazing experience. It's amazing to just go back and kind of experience that, and sort of just to be kind of aware of like how all of that stuff that I've brought forward, you know, is like everything we've discussed is represented or fetishized or kind of, you know, and how you negotiate that between the two worlds, you know. I mean, definitely him more than me, because as I say, I was just kind of doing the casting, and once it was done, it was just done. But it was also like, you know, these girls are great, you know, these girls are amazing, and it was really interesting to kind of be around them and, you know, what they're into and why they like their clothes, and it was, you know, it was a great time. Now looking at those pictures, it kind of, you know, it doesn't even really look like a fashion spread, you know. It just looks like an amazing portrait series. Yeah, I started New Pod Studio with Ebru Aircon, who I knew from when she was a women's wear designer. You know, my main kind of influences were me kind of fooling around and doing that kind of weird demi-drag kind of theatrical stuff mixed with these youth culture-y sort of casuals and then acid house kind of things, then kind of whacking those two together. I don't know if I necessarily had, when I first started, the confidence to whack those things two together. You know, I can remember like wearing Reebok classics, and you know, I did a shoot in, I don't know, 99 or 2000 and stuff, and you know, doing pink Reebok classics and all those kind of things. They just kind of didn't exist, you know. And then Reebok didn't want to lend me Reebok classics, you know. I had to go to JD Sports, so I had to buy them, you know, because they'd have some new. They'd be like, oh, you know, because they had like weird statistics about like 45% of criminals wear Reebok classics, you know, all this crazy stuff. It's not like I was the kind of first person to kind of reappropriate, you know, some sort of like working class aesthetic or something like that. That's kind of not what I'm saying, definitely. But I think that doing, you know, pink painted, definitely. I mean, there was definitely something in the hand painted pink Reebok classics, because that definitely kind of hit right in the core of the working class male and the kind of camp, and the, you know, it was a little bit like that. And but you couldn't get anything like that at Reebok. You know, they'd probably have some like judo pump that they wanted to kind of, you know, get into the magazines, you know, and they didn't want anything to do with that. Loads of those labels the same, you know, Moschino and Ralph Lauren, and you know, they didn't want anything to do with the cool kids that were actually wearing it, especially in England. You know, all those like amazing black kind of garage boys that were wearing all the kind of printed stuff and everything. You know, you would see those in the campaigns. Jeremy Scott said now maybe you would, but you wouldn't see those in the campaigns. And that was like the cooler end of what their label was. I mean, the rest of it is like what, like stuffy kind of, and at the time like stuffy kind of middle class Italian women or something. I don't know. So it was kind of always that snobbery, which you know you see time and time again, right? And they kind of shift it around a little bit. I mean, I guess you'll always have that less authentic way, and maybe that's okay as well, because you get other things that come out of that as well. You know, that can also look interesting. I think it's also not important to kind of like hang on, because that can become very boring. To kind of hang on to the sort of worthiness and kind of, you know, because there's lots of problems within the origins of that. You know, it's very conservative, and you know, like I said about, you know, all that kind of, you know, hyper masculinity and stuff like that. It's not only to kind of like be around that and to be whatever, but for those boys themselves, you know. And this is what I do see happen, which is kind of problematic, is this people like the aesthetic, and they like the sex appeal, and they like the brute appeal, but they're kind of really pushing this aesthetic, but not really kind of looking beneath the surface of what the reality of why that aesthetic comes through, which is usually, you know, fear and vulnerability, and it's cool boys walking around with hoodies. Well, they're walking around with hoodies because they're scared shitless and live on council estates. You know, they probably wouldn't necessarily be dressing like that. And like all the middle class kids can dress like that because they want to look a bit cooler, because they don't live on, you know, council estates and all that kind of thing. So all those boys kind of standing around, like I was saying, in the club, and all the girls in the middle, and they're all looking tough, and they've all, you know, got skinheads, and they're all like, you know, not really dancing, and definitely not showing any feminine side, and definitely showing any vulnerability. That is all problematic. In the same way that you would see with, because it's repressive, you know, and you really feel it. You know, you feel this like repression. I wouldn't say it's exclusively an English thing, but it's a very English thing. You know, that kind of that uptightness. So when I see that kind of pedal out a lot, I do think that it's very kind of fetishized, and I think that unless you kind of from that and you know the flip realities of that, it's kind of a little bit like it's a bit like a kind of look, isn't it?